Hi, and welcome to Journey to Recovery. Today we're going to do a book review on surviving a borderline parent. So, hey, book review, Surviving a Borderline Parent. How to heal your childhood wounds and build trust, boundaries, and self-esteem. This is one of the go-to books I use for a lot of my patients who are dealing with a lot of different issues who came from addicted or borderline families or just troubled families. There's a lot of really good information that can be gleaned from it, even if the patient's family of origin didn't have someone with a borderline personality disorder. So the target audience for this group is adults and older adolescents. It's not something that's really going to be useful for a child who's 13, 14, 15, 16, depending on developmental level. You might start being able to make some of the activities useful. I have used it effectively with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. So obviously, the person ideally would have a parent with borderline personality disorder or an addictive disorder in order for this book to be sort of on point for them. Like I said, if they have other issues, that doesn't mean that the book isn't useful. You're just going to have to use your clinical knowledge to pull out some of the resources that are going to be helpful. Favorite parts of this book: practical tools and skills throughout the book. It provides a lot of information in a very, very short space, and every time it provides a snippet, if you will, it provides an activity. So people are not going through and reading a bunch and then having to apply it at the end, which makes it really applicable to people with multiple learning styles. It provides a reader-friendly presentation of a very complicated topic, and it's very useful not only in individual counseling and self-help situations, but also in group settings. If you decide to take the CEU course that's based on this book, a lot of what I spend time on is talking about how to take the activities from within the group, or within the book, and apply them to a group situation so you can process them in IOP, residential settings, those sorts of things. So, if you're taking the CEU portion, we're going to start that now. If you were just interested in a little bit about what the book was, the book review is finished, so you can turn me off. All right, objectives. We're going to review the characteristics of borderline personality disorder. You know this is one of my pet topics. We're going to compare and contrast borderline personality disorder, or BPD, because I'm not going to say borderline personality disorder for the next 2 hours. We're going to compare and contrast that with addictive behaviors. There are a lot of similarities. When patients come in for treatment, especially when they're in that initial action stage, they're at bottom, they're really motivated to change, they're talking about what some of their behaviors are. The first thing that you hear is a lot of stuff that sounds like borderline personality disorder. The addictive behaviors mirror in many ways BPD. So we want to make sure that we rule out and differentially diagnose, if you want to use a fancy word, addictive behaviors from BPD, because addictive behaviors have been learned and can be unlearned. BPD, on the other hand, while it has been learned over time, is a whole lot more pervasive. So slight differences in the way that we're going to approach treatment and ongoing maintenance of recovery behaviors. And then we're going to examine ways to implement the activities presented in the book in a group format. We know that group treatment for addictive behaviors, as well as for some personality disorders, can be very, very useful because the group can call each other out, they can pull each other up, they can see themselves in one another. You have that transference, counter-transference thing going on. So I really love using different activities in group in order to encourage people to explore their own blind spots. So let's look at some of the characteristics of borderline personality disorder, or BPD, and addiction. Both people with BPD and addiction have a poorly developed or unstable self-image. The person with BPD has never developed a stable self-image. They have always been appreciated for who they are, and the expectations and demands, as we'll talk about later, have always kind of changed and been on roller skates. So life has always seemed very unpredictable. They don't know if they're loved or if they're hated. They don't know what they're supposed to do versus what they're not supposed to do, because things just change constantly and there's no rhyme or reason, so it's confusing. People with addictions may or may not have had a stable self-image when they were growing up, depending on when their addiction started. But at this point, they don't really know who they are anymore, what they like, what they want to do. They just know they need the pain to stop. Both of these, people with BPD and people with addiction, have really negative, dark voices, for lack of a better word, inside their head. And I'm not talking about voices like schizophrenic voices. I'm talking about those tapes we play over and over again, those things we latch onto. Somebody when you were 8 said you were fat, or you were a slob, or you were good for nothing, or you would never amount to anything. Those are the things people, unfortunately, latch onto sometimes, and those are the things that become self-fulfilling prophecies. Every time somebody makes a mistake, they hear that you're a screw-up. Very general, very broad, very overarching statements, which negatively impacts self-esteem and makes the person, wonder if they're worthy of existing. The pain has to stop. In order to want to live, we have to have hope, faith, courage, desire to get out of bed in the morning. If you feel like you're a screw-up all the time, guess what? Probably don't want to get out of bed. Difficulty recognizing the feelings and needs of others. People with BPD don't have a stable self-image. They don't know how they feel. They rely on other people to tell them how they feel. But the pain of not knowing who they are, not knowing what they stand for, and not feeling good about themselves is so overwhelming, they don't have the energy to deal with other people's stuff. They've also learned over time that other people's reactions, behaviors, thoughts, and feelings seem to be very unpredictable and can change on a moment's notice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true, but that's their perception. So it's really hard to want to pay attention and be empathetic if it's just like, well, so-and-so's mad today, they'll be fine tomorrow, or vice versa. They're fine today, but tomorrow, who knows? People with addictions, kind of on the other hand, or in the same light, depending on how you want to look at it, they've got so much stuff and negativity and drama and problems and however you want to characterize it going on in their own life and in their own head. They don't have time to deal with your drama. It's not that they don't want to. They don't have the energy left. All their energy is devoted to trying to survive. And both of these groups of people, people with BPD and addiction, they're not mean. They're hurting. They're doing the best they can with the tools they have at this point in time. Our job as clinicians is to give them better tools, or to take the tools they have and make them more effective. Interpersonal hypersensitivity, prone to feeling slighted or insulted. So this interpersonal sensitivity comes out in terms of people who always feel like if something goes wrong or if somebody says something that they disagree with, that the person was saying it in order to hurt them. It was an intentional slight. You can call it hypervigilance, you can call it overreaction, you can call it egocentrism, whatever you want to call it. But basically, this interpersonal hypersensitivity translates to people feeling like the world is out to get them. And they are very aware, hyper aware of how people are reacting. Those reactions are in turn taken and internalized. John's mad. It must be because of something I did. Sally's happy. Well, we know the negative self-fulfilling prophecy. Sally's happy. Well, I can change that. She won't be happy as long as she's around me. We want to be aware of what it's like in our patients' heads. The borderline parent is going through all of these things. The borderline parent has a poorly developed or unstable self-image. Let's think about this. So you take a grown-up, or at least somebody in a grown-up body, and you give them a little child who, by all rights, has an unstable self-image because they're developmentally not at the same place. and you put them together, and what happens? The child learns the same things that the adult knows, if you will. So you start developing your own little carbon copy borderline child. All right, so let's go on. Perceptions of others tend to focus on negative attributes or vulnerabilities. So people with borderline personality disorder, they will hone in on people's weaknesses. They will hone in on people's negative attributes. Why? If I focus on all the reasons you're awesome and I feel like crap, then I'm going to feel more like crap. If I hone in on all the reasons that you suck, and I already think I suck, then at least we're on the same playing field. It's not fair. It's not happy because it keeps that playing field down here in negativity land, if you will. But it is the way it is. Intense, unstable, and conflicted close relationships marked by mistrust, neediness, and fear of abandonment. Okay, so you have this grown-up. They are completely defining themselves based on the roles they have as mother, wife, employee. Without those roles, that person sort of ceases to exist. Without other people telling them, you're okay, they're not okay. So yeah, they get into a relationship, that becomes a role. So, okay, that's part of me now. So I am a wife. Now, if it looks like my marriage might be falling apart, oh crap, that means part of me is dying. It's not something that you can say, oh, it's a relationship, you know, I'll get another one. Part of me, the wife, is dying. So what do you do when something that is part of you is becoming completely dysfunctional? You freak out sometimes because they don't know what to do. If I'm not a wife, what am I? I don't know, which is scary. So the person starts to react like a scared cat. Neediness and fear of abandonment. I need you in my life to tell me that I'm okay because I can't tell myself that yet. If you leave me, I'll be alone forever because I don't know how to form other relationships. Close relationships are viewed in extremes of idealization and devaluation, which is a bunch of gobbledygook for it can turn on a dime. I either love you or I hate you, and I can love you and hate you in the same hour. As soon as the person says something that I like, oh, we're best friends. As soon as the person starts to express a dissenting opinion or idea, they are the devil. There's no middle ground. There's no, well, you can have your opinion, we can agree to disagree. No, that doesn't work. It's my way or the highway. Unfortunately, with people with BPD, the highway is not really an option because if you take the highway, then you're leaving, and we're back to that whole abandonment thing. So there's lots of conflict going on. And alternating between over-involvement and withdrawal. So one moment I might be all up in your business, and the next moment I might be over there pouting. Let's think about what that does. If I'm all up in your business, then I know what's going on, I can control the situation, or at least try to control it, and there's fewer surprises. Going back to withdrawal, when I get exhausted being all up in your business, I may withdraw, but most people with addictions or borderline issues tend to expect the significant others to chase them. I'm going to withdraw, and let's see if you really love me. You'll come after me if you really love me. So all of these behaviors create a very tenuous situation for the person who's borderline. They don't know who they are, what they like, why they should exist, who's their friend, what to expect from one moment to the next, from other people as well as themselves. Okay, so I want you to put yourself in their head for a minute. That's a scary place to be. I mean, I am a J. I love structure, kind of sort of more than life itself some days. So it's really scary for me. But for anybody, not knowing that you're okay just because you're you, That's got to be sad. So, the effects on others. This person with borderline, with all these characteristics we've discussed, is the parent in the household. The children go around doing child things. Children are expected to push boundaries. I remember when my son was about 20 months old. We were at my grandmother's house, and he walked over to the TV, and he looked at the TV, and he looked at me, and he looked at the TV, and he said, "Don't touch." I said, "That's right, don't touch." And he looked at me, and he looked at the TV, and he reached out and he touched it. Then he looked back at me and he said, "Time out." I said, "Yep, time out." Children are supposed to do, well, not necessarily quite that well. I was so proud. But children are supposed to test boundaries. We were in a new situation. We were at my grandmother's house where we'd never been before. So the little scientist in his mind was trying to figure out if the rules were still the same. And, they were. When children of a borderline act out, the borderline takes it as a failure. I'm awful as a mother because my child made a mistake. Because remember, egocentrism, it all revolves around you. So the child is left to feel inadequate because the parent gets upset because they feel inadequate, criticizes the child. This is the whole negative circle. Lack of emotional boundaries. The child begins to feel responsible for the parent's happiness. Okay, I've got to walk on eggshells and make sure I don't make a mistake, because as soon as I do, mom freaks out, and when mom freaks out, all hell breaks loose. So the child learns from a very early age to be sort of an emotional chameleon. I'm going to read everybody in the room so I know what their expectations are, and I will do whatever they want just to keep the peace. It doesn't matter what I want. So the child is already starting to distance from his or her own thoughts, feelings, wishes, and needs. The biggest overarching concern is keeping the peace. And they feel guilty for personal happiness. The borderline is never happy, or rarely happy. So the child feels guilty for being happy. As a child, it's hard to say, well, you can choose to be miserable, but I'm having a great day. As an adult, that's kind of hard to do. But for a child, it's almost impossible. So the child learns to feel guilty for being happy unless the borderline parent is happy. The child learns that they're responsible for the parent's happiness, and if the parent isn't happy, nobody's happy. You see how this is kind of creating a negative spiral of things? Difficulty trusting people due to alternations between feeling appreciated and condemned. Again, boundaries on roller skates. So the child is responsible for the parent's happiness. Okay, you see the problem with that. We're going to take it a step further, because when the child does things right, quote unquote, and the parent is happy, then the child is appreciated. When the child makes a mistake, because OMG, people are fallible, they're condemned. There is no middle ground. There is no gray space. You're either perfect and appreciated, or you're a screw up and condemned. You got to figure out which side of the fence you're going to be on. And then the child starts to develop anxiety because the parent's unpredictable. It's exhausting to be around somebody with borderline because you've got to be able to read them. You've got to be able to read them accurately. You've got to be able to keep them happy because they can't keep themselves happy. They can't self-soothe. There's a lot of blaming, a lot of arguing, and that egocentrism where everything comes back to it's got to be about the borderline. So in the beginning of this book, it provides a quick overview of the purpose. And one of the things that you can do with your group in order to help them figure out whether they had a borderline-ish family member, and for the rest of today, I'll probably talk about borderline-ish. That sort of encompasses people who actually have borderline personality disorder, as well as people who just have characteristics, personality disorder, NOS, or however you want to call it. We're going to call it borderline-ish. Review the Now as an Adult, Do You section of the Does This Sound Familiar checklist. So when you go into the introduction, there's a checklist. You want to go through it and see which things sound familiar. Have patients mark those off and talk about in what ways do those sound familiar. How did that happen in your family? Because it looks different between families. And as people start to talk, other people will go, oh, you know, we did that in my family too. Identify manifestations of these behaviors and ways to change them. So, for example, going back to the borderline takes everything personally. If your clients have now learned as adults that those same behaviors and everything that happens they take personally, you can start working on some cognitive behavioral interventions to help them see that, you know, it's not all about them. It didn't rain today because they got out of bed. You can talk about different takeaway messages they got about the world being unpredictable and ways they can journal or talk to people or however they want to make sense of it in order to sort of get a sense that there is some predictability in the world. We can focus on all the unpredictable things, or we can focus on all the predictable ones. Part of it is what you're focusing on, because there are certain unpredictable things. People are going to cut you off in traffic. People who are supposed to call won't call. It's not all about you. It's because things happen. And this is an integral part of recovery for BPD and addiction. We go to that whole serenity prayer. Grant me the courage to accept the things I cannot change, or the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There are some things you can't change. There are some things you can't predict. There are some things you can, and you need to get off your butt and do it. Figuring out what the difference is crucial. So we move into part 1, looking at the past. There are 3 main sections. I never knew it had a name, all grown up, and grieving a lost childhood. One of the things that I've heard over and over for the past 15 years from people is, I didn't have the parents I wanted. I had a horrible childhood. I didn't get to have a childhood. Yeah, you didn't. And it stinks. And I'm sorry, but I can't teleport you back in time. So what are we going to do about it? Part of it is grieving. Part of it is reparenting. And part of it is discovering that that little kid didn't have to go away. You know, I'm the first one to build a pillow fort in the middle of the living room and watch cartoons on a rainy Saturday or a sunny Saturday. Or you have to find what makes you happy. So, I never knew it had a name. Examines the symptoms of BPD and the takeaway messages for the child, talking about how life is unpredictable, how people can't be trusted, how it's the child's responsibility to make sure that the adults are okay. It explores a variety of fairy tale models of borderline personality disorder. And I'm not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty of the different parts of the book because I think it's really worth the read. It's a short book, so even if you hate reading, you can probably get through it in a week if you just do a section at a time. But it is a fabulously written book. And then it discusses acting out versus acting in behaviors of the person with borderline personality disorder. We know some of the acting out behaviors we see, the cutting, the throwing things, the look what you made me do behaviors, but also acting in, self-hatred, punishing oneself. So in I Never Knew It Had a Name, the first group activity you can look at is discussing the function of each symptom for the parent. So if we're looking at the pattern of unstable relationships, and I talked about that a little bit earlier. Why does this person have this pattern? Why are the relationships unstable? Why do they alternate between loving somebody and hating somebody and like seemingly switch on a dime? What makes that happen? This is time to put on your little scientific caps. Figure out what motivates that behavior. Because I've said it before, say it again, humans do not do things without a benefit. Even, why were you banging your head in the wall? Because it feels so good when I stop. Same sort of thing here. There's a benefit to that person. We have to figure out what that is and help them meet that need or eliminate that need in a healthier way. Have participants identify any behaviors they have which may also resemble that symptom. The hypervigilance, the inappropriate anger outbursts, lots of blaming, unstable sense of self. We talked about that earlier. Have your participants actually specifically identify 2 or 3 situations or 2 or 3 behaviors that exemplify any of the symptoms that are going on. That way they're personalizing it and they're going, okay, I see this in myself in this way, this way, and this way. Because then we can go, well, so why are you doing that? How's that working for you? And what can you do differently that would be healthier and more helpful? Then review and refute the takeaways, providing practical cognitive and interpersonal skills. So, for example, the takeaways being the world is unpredictable. Some things are unpredictable, that's true. But in large part, let's look at yesterday and the day before and the day before that. What happened and what parts of those days were relatively predictable? You got up at 6:30 in the morning. The sun came up at, roughly 6:45, whatever time of year it is. There are a lot of things you can hone in on that are predictable. So on your whiteboard or something else, start making a list of all those things that are predictable in people's days. And then you can make another list of the unpredictable things that happened and start comparing and seeing, was the day more unpredictable or predictable? Now, obviously, there are going to be times like, natural disasters where the world is unpredictable. But on a general day-to-day basis, life is relatively predictable. Even things like getting cut off in traffic. If you're driving during rush hour, there are going to be people that are in a hurry and they're going to be driving stupid. So there's a likelihood you're going to get cut off. That's actually pretty predictable. You just don't know when it is. These are activities people can do to help start seeing life as predictable. They can also start looking at that personalization aspect and talking about how when Sally made a comment, they took it personally. When Sally came into the room and Sally was in a bad mood and they figured they had done something wrong. Okay, so let's talk about why did you immediately go there? Sally came in the room and was in a bad mood. She could have, stubbed her toes, spilled coffee all over her car, whatever. Okay, you know what I do now. But the things that you need to look at and have that person look at is, what are the chances it was really about you? How integral are you to Sally's world at that point in time? It takes a whole lot of stress off people if they can stop blaming themselves for everything everybody else does. If the cashier at the grocery store is being snitty, it probably has nothing to do with your client, but the client takes it personally. That's a waste of energy. Have people keep a daily log. It doesn't have to be a journal. It doesn't have to be a diary. A daily log of incidents where they took something personally, and then you can process that in group. Stop and think. The lessons are clear. This is group activity 2. The lessons are clear. It's an activity that's in the book, but you can do it in a group format by going through the lessons that the child of a borderline parent learned, identifying how that was exemplified in their family, and refuting it now. For example, I am responsible for my parents' happiness. No child should be responsible for their parents' happiness. So, that was a takeaway message. How do we refute it now? The parent is responsible for the parent's happiness. I am responsible for doing the next right thing and making sure that I don't intentionally cause my parent distress, but I am not responsible for his or her happiness. Likewise, I'm not responsible for his or her unhappiness. If they choose to be in a bad mood, then that is probably their choice. And there are some gray areas there. If you break into their house and steal all their money and kidnap their dog, it's going to make them unhappy. But if you're generally doing the next right thing, then it's the other person's responsibility to figure out if they're going to get all snickered up about something or if they're going to let it go. All Grown Up examines the effect of the borderline personality on the living conditions. Chaos. It was chaotic. What did your life look like when you were growing up? In what ways was it chaotic? Let's talk about abuse and neglect. A lot of times, there probably wasn't physical abuse, but let's look at emotional abuse and neglect of meeting the child's needs, not being there emotionally, being verbally abusive, those sorts of things. Have people look at it, and one of the things I like to do is have two different whiteboards, the past and the present. Have people look at the past first. What did chaos look like in their family of origin? What did abuse and neglect look like? Boundary violations, getting in your physical space, getting in your personal space, getting in your emotional space, telling you how you're allowed to feel and what you're allowed to think. Invalidation, telling you, I don't know where you got that from. Role reversals, the child having to become the parent. Looks are everything. It's all about appearance. We're going to put on the show for everybody that we have a perfect family. And you're going to smile and you're going to nod and it's all going to be good. And having a keen perception, because remember, you have to be aware of what's going on with the borderline in order to keep the peace. You have to walk on eggshells. And that is, by the way, another really good book, Stop Walking on Eggshells. But I digress. So you're going to go through that for their family of origin. And then you're going to switch gears and go through that for their current situation. How are you creating chaos in your family? How are you reenacting your family of origin? Because guess what? We do what we know. And if you know dysfunction, then you're going to do dysfunction. Doesn't mean you can't change it. You can't learn new behaviors. You can't do other things. It just means that it is what it is. The next section moves on to 6 seeds to growing a healthy child. Talks about support, respect, and acceptance. Giving the person a voice, the ability to have their own feelings, thoughts, impressions. Unconditional love and affection. That's a tough one. Consistency and security. So again, the past, go over it on the board, and how are you reenacting that in the present? A lot of times, this is going to be a fast activity. But then you can go back through and say, all right, we can't change the past. It's the way it is. But we can change the present. What things can you do? Now, here's a novel idea. For yourself. How can you be supportive of yourself, your own ideas? How can you have self-confidence? How can you respect and accept yourself for who you are? Foibles and all. How can you give yourself a voice? And the first answer is take that phrase, I don't care, out of your vocabulary. There are some times you really don't care, but most of the time, You have an opinion. You have a thought. You have, opinions and thoughts. So make sure to start giving yourself a voice. It may not be speaking up to other people right away. It may be just giving yourself a voice in your own head, waking up and going, well, I really should do those 3 loads of laundry, but I want to go hiking. Is it okay? Can you give yourself permission to do what you want to do, assuming you have enough clean clothes to go hiking? Unconditional love and affection. What does this mean? It means loving yourself and or other people for who they are, not what they do for you. Slight semantic difference when we are parenting our children. Instead of saying you're a bad boy, saying I love you, what you did was bad. I disapprove of that behavior. Very slight semantic difference, and I know some people are kind of rolling their eyes right now. But that bad boy translates to you're a screw up, not you made a mistake. See, that's a bigger difference. And in a child's world, it's all or nothing. Little children cognitively don't have the ability to see the in-betweens, which is why it's really hard for children who are abused to understand what's going on is not their fault, because they're like, mommy and daddy love me, mommy and daddy hurt me. Well, they must hurt me because they love me, which means I must have done something wrong. There's no mommy and daddy love me, but they've got anger management problems and sometimes misdirect their anger. You're not going to hear a 6-year-old say that. So unconditional love and affection means telling yourself every day, just like Stuart Smalley, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. And if you can actually say that in the mirror with a straight face, I want to see it. Consistency. Remember, in the borderline world, there's no consistency. What I tell you to do one day is probably going to be wrong the next day or the day after that, but you're not going to know it's a secret. I'm going to change the rules on you however it fits my mood. So part of growing a healthy child and reparenting yourself is being consistent, saying, I need to do this, I want to do this, it's okay, it's not okay. Not changing up every once in a while and going, oh, it's okay to do it today, but not tomorrow, unless there's a reason. Security. Knowing that you're going to have your basic needs met. You're not going to be thrown out the door. Knowing that you've got friends, you've got somewhere to go, you've got something to do. These 6 seeds, you can talk about, again, in 2 different ways, the 2 boards, how they can do it for themselves. Because until they can do it for themselves, they're not going to do it very well for other people, most of the time. Every once in a while, you find somebody who can do for others, but still can't do for them because they don't feel worthy. But I digress. Talk about how they can do it for themselves, and then talk about how they can do it in their current family, with their significant others, the ones that are healthy. How can you be supportive? How can you show respect and acceptance? How can you let them have a voice without taking it personally if they disagree? How can you show, exhibit, manifest, whatever word you want to use, unconditional love and affection? In what ways are you currently inconsistent, and how can you be more consistent? None of us, or at least most of us, are not 100% consistent 100% of the time. We're not consistently consistent. I had way too much coffee before this presentation. Anyhow, it's important to recognize that we all have some room where we could be a little bit more consistent, but it's also important to realize that you also have to give yourself a little bit of leeway. For example, checking my children's chores. My children are children, and what are they going to do? They're going to try to get away with stuff. Some days I go in and you'd think they were in the military, white glove test, looking at the baseboards, looking at the door jambs. Other days I walk in, I'm like, yeah, it looks good enough. I'm not overly consistent at the thoroughness that I inspect their chores every day. So it's kind of hit or miss. Now, is that important? And that's what it comes down to. Is it important to my children's welfare that I am consistent in the way that I inspect their chores? Not really. I have tightened it up a little bit, so on those days I just don't feel like doing the white glove inspection. I'll walk in, I will look more closely, and I will point out the things they missed. But it's not quite as in-depth. And then security. How do you make people feel safe and secure? How does a person feel safe and secure? First thing, they've got to have a stable self-image. If someone is lonely in a room full of people and lonely when they're home by themselves, that's a problem. People can be alone and not lonely. And that's one of the big differences. We all need to feel like we're a part of something. We all need to feel like we've got security. We all need to feel safe. And you need to feel safe in your own head. So all those nasty voices, you need to be able to turn them off. You need to feel okay. It's going to differ for each patient how they define security and what they start doing to make themselves feel more safe and secure. But they do need to start working on that. Group activity. Examine each effect of the borderline personality. Discuss how each was present in the family of origin. Discuss how each is manifested in the current life. And identify methods to eliminate those dysfunctional patterns. The seeds. Discuss how to use those 6 principles to reparent and nurture the self and to nurture healthy relationships with others. That's what we just talked about. This is kind of just the short version. I got ahead of myself. Guess. Group activity 3, stop and think, resiliency builders. In the book, there are activities that are labeled stop and think. This one is called resiliency builders. And it talks about, okay, brace yourself here, ways to build resilience. Imagine that. Have patients brainstorm how they can do it for themselves, because we're not all going to use the same techniques. Do it in group, because they'll give each other ideas. Resiliency is the ability to bounce back when you have a bad day, when you have a bad moment, to start developing that security and feeling safe in your own head and in your own skin. And grieving a lost childhood. First thing, understand the grieving process. Grieving doesn't mean forgetting. Grieving doesn't mean giving up. But grieving means accepting the past is the past. And there's a process. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Kubler-Ross's stages, you may or may not care about those. But you can help people identify, especially the denial, anger, and bargaining, or denial, anger, and depression. Bargaining's harder. Anyway, help people identify how they're stuck in those phases of the grief resolution process. If they talk about it and they still sound extremely bitter, point it out. You may or may not be onto something. You know, that whole Rogerian thing, they'll correct us if we're wrong. But helping people understand what they're angry about, what they're hurting about, what they're resentful about, is the first step in helping them deal with it and figure out what to do now. Reviewing messages received in childhood about dealing with losses. The borderline parent probably was not very able to be compassionate and consoling and all those wonderful things when there was a loss. It was probably a suck it up and move on, everything abandoned to you at some time. So, for the child who grew up in that environment, figuring out how to deal with that, all those moments, all those losses that have been locked down for so long, they need to be dealt with. Not having a good mother or a good father, not having a good childhood, Whatever it is that they are resentful about, let's talk about it and figure out how to come to a point of acceptance that it was. Can't change it. What can we do henceforth and forevermore to not be drugged down by it? Identifying losses and feelings associated with the dysfunctional childhood. What kinds of losses happened? Maybe you didn't have friends that you wanted. Maybe you didn't take trips or do adventures that you wanted because you were so afraid it would anger the borderline parent. Maybe you felt trapped. All of these, and that would be a loss of freedom. All of these are different losses that you can talk about, and talk about how to grieve them and how to give yourself permission to maybe experience those a little bit now. And identify continuing issues with the borderline addicted parent, because that person is probably still in the patient's life. Grieving a lost childhood. Describe what you would have liked your childhood to be like. Now, the first thing I think of when I think of the perfect family is Ward and June Cleaver. You know, that's not necessarily how I would have wanted my childhood to be like. Have each person describe, if they could relive their childhood, what would be different. And then as a group, identify ways to translate that to present day. Well, maybe the person wanted to be a gymnast or a musician, and they just never got the opportunity. Well, if they're 30, they're probably a little bit, too late to be a gymnast on the USA national team. But they could learn how to do gymnastics, or they could choose something else. Why did they want to be a gymnast? Because they liked gymnastics? Well, then do gymnastics. Because they wanted to be appreciated for something? Well, what can you do now that you might be appreciated for? Have the group brainstorm what they could do now in order to try to fulfill some of those missed opportunities from childhood. Part 2 brings us to the present. Guilt, responsibility, and forgiveness. People who are children of borderline parents have a lot of guilt and are overly responsible. They take exceptional responsibility for anything that happens to anybody else. Overcoming anger and resentment, communicating and setting limits, reconstructing the past, and assessing the present. Those are the 4 sections in part 2. Guilt, responsibility, and forgiveness identifies potential guilt triggers for the adult child of a borderline parent. One of the things that is pervasive when working with a child who grew up in a borderline family is that the borderline parent used guilt to control. Look what you made me do. If you were better at this, that, and the other, then I wouldn't have had to. Everything is your fault. So the child learns to feel guilty. Now we need to stop and have the child, the adult patient, however you want to refer to the person, start identifying the things that make them feel guilty, that trigger that guilt reaction. They can start analyzing and going, is this my problem? Do I need to feel guilty about this? Guilt implies something you did wrong or something you failed to do. So did you do something wrong or fail to do something that was reasonable? And if the answer is no, then guilt is not an appropriate thing to hold on to. Feel it, dismiss it, move on. Easier said than done. There are a lot of activities in dialectical behavior therapy that you can use to help your clients deal with these emotions, guilt, fear, anger, all that stuff. Not going to go into those right now, but take home from this is people need to start identifying what makes them feel guilty. Because we, as individuals, do not make anybody else do anything. They choose to. Now, That's not exactly what my kids will tell you. But they choose to because they would rather do their chores than choose the option of punishment. So it's a choice. I don't make them do it. Discuss how guilt works and what the benefits and motivations for guilt may be. Well, let's think about it. If I make you feel guilty, what are you going to do? You're going to succumb to whatever I want you to do. I can control you. So making someone feel guilty produces a benefit. Not only does it produce an immediate benefit, but if you make them feel bad, you can use that against them. Is that healthy? No. But I'm telling you that this is what we're talking about as far as rewards and benefits of these behaviors for the person with borderline personality disorder. They don't feel like you will do something just because they want you to. They feel like they've got to coerce you. Identifies and discusses different origins of guilt. Where did this come from? Where do all these shoulds come from? I should have this, that, and the other. I should this, that, and the other. And if you don't, what's the outcome? A lot of times, it's no big deal. I should do laundry tonight. And I may not. When I was growing up, my grandma would always go through the house and make sure it was clean. And she would always put perfume on before she went to bed, just in case a fire broke out. Now, logically, you're going, if a fire broke out, nobody's going to really care if the house is clean and you smell good. But in her mind, that's what she needed to do in order to be properly presentable if the fire department showed up. And if she didn't do that, it caused her great amounts of anxiety and guilt. She'd get up in the morning and she'd be like, oh, she'd be beside herself because the house wasn't perfectly straight. Identifies and discusses different origins of guilt. So again, we're going to talk about where does your guilt come from? Encourages identification of what can and cannot be controlled. We talked about that earlier. We're going to talk about it again. Guilt means you should have done something or you did something wrong. Sometimes you did what you were supposed to do and it just turned out wrong. It happens. And sometimes those things can't be controlled. So you need to look at what happened. Prime example. We live on a farm and we had a chicken get sick last night. And all of our girls are pets to us. And so my daughter brings the chicken, who we named Goose, long story, brings Goose in. And we get Goose all set up in the bathroom in a little chicken ICU, start giving her fluids every 30 minutes, food, trying to figure out what's wrong, doing our very best to take care of her. Long story short, Goose ended up having a couple seizures and passed away. Haley, my daughter, takes this very, very personally. Goose died on my watch. No, Goose died. You just happened to be the one that was on duty at that point in time. There was nothing different that we could have done that I know of, short of taking her to the emergency vet. And I don't know that he could have done anything either. So, looking at guilt, should she, she feels guilty and we'll work through that. But if you're going to look at it from an objective point of view, is there blame? Is there guilt to be placed there? No. There was nothing we could do to control that situation. Did I feel guilty? Yeah, for a second, I did. More because my daughter felt bad, but that's part of farm life, and they knew that going into it. Okay, so figuring out what parts of guilt are reasonable, what parts need to be let go. Exploring the issue of responsibility. What are you responsible for? What are you not? And encourages participants to examine their beliefs related to forgiveness. Ooh, that's a tough one. Forgiveness, in many of the groups I've done, is worse, the worst F word you could possibly say. Because forgiveness in a lot of people's minds means saying, you know, that's okay. And it's not. A lot of times, things that happen are not okay. So helping them define forgiveness or acceptance as saying, it happened, it was awful, you may have done the wrong things, but I cannot hold my energy, keep my energy tied up in being angry and resentful and hateful anymore. You can do an entire group or two on forgiveness because it's a difficult, very challenging concept for people to be okay with. They can hear it, they can talk about it, but it's difficult for a lot of people to be okay with. So group activity 1, complete an ABC worksheet. If you've done cognitive behavioral therapy, activating event, automatic beliefs, and consequences. Explore beliefs about guilt. So something happens, you know, Goose passes away, I felt guilty. What were my automatic beliefs? I should have been able to save her. I should have given her antibiotics sooner. I should have, you know, I've got a litany of shouldas. But I've got to go back through and continue to ask myself, did I do what in my mind was the best thing to do at that point in time? And if the answer is yes, then I can look back and say, well, I made some mistakes, but, you know, should I feel guilty? And for each person, they're going to have to come to their own decision about that. Disputing and evaluate using the prompts in Stop and Think. Am I guilty? So again, Stop and Think is a section in the book, and they go through a lot of things that people who grew up in borderline families feel guilty for. You want to review each of these, talk about why people may be espousing these beliefs about guilt, and then refute them. Talk about why they should consider not feeling guilty about it. Group activity 2. In the reframing section in the book, use the concepts about personal responsibility as group discussion starters. I am responsible for, and there's lots of prompts in there. Again, this is just another way to help people identify those things they can control versus those things they cannot. Another Stop and Think activity, taking ownership. There are statements in there that I want you to post, well, if it were me, I would, post on easel sheets around the room. And refer to them when people are feeling powerless or not taking ownership of something. So these are statements that encourage people to take ownership for their feelings, their actions, and their thoughts. The F word, like I said, forgiveness. Sometimes it's feelings, but in this particular book, it's forgiveness. Under the section, Why Forgive, there are 7 questions. Have the group process each one of these questions so they can come to the understanding for themselves, each person for his or herself, why they might want to consider forgiveness. The next section is Overcoming Anger and Resentment. It examines the functions of anger and how it works. Now we remember primitively, we have the fight or flight reaction. Anger or fear. Anger protects us. I'll say it again. Anger protects us. It can protect us from ourselves. It can protect us from other people. Depending on how it manifests, it can be useful, but if you hold on to it and nurture it and let it grow, it can overcome you. It explores the many faces of anger. What does anger look like? There's passive aggressive, there's outward anger, there's turning that anger inward and just trying to bury all your feelings. Discusses the way people cope with anger. Some people do it well, some people not so much. Encourages people to think about what it means to them to let go of anger. If I choose not to be angry about something, does it mean I'm weak? Does it mean I'm a failure? Does it mean I'm giving up? Or does it mean I'm just choosing not to invest energy in something that really doesn't matter that much to me after all? It highlights the consequences of anger. Anger takes its toll on your energy, on your sleep, on your health, on your relationships, on your work product, on your concentration, on your tummy. Anger is just a really detrimental thing if it's let to get out of control. Now, it's a natural emotion. You're going to feel it. It's what you do with it that can be dysfunctional. And it provides tools to help your patients start managing their anger a little bit better. Remember, growing up in a borderline or addicted family, the borderline or addicted parent probably didn't manage anger very well. It was either peaceful or all hell was breaking loose. Which means Junior never learned how to self-soothe and deal with anger and depression and fear and all of those things. So we need to start providing some tools on how to healthfully cope with anger. So the stop and think section talks about reframing triggers. Looking at anger triggers. What makes you angry? Is it all about you? Are there potential other explanations for what's going on, etc.? Have group members identify an example of when they've felt angry about something and use reframing tools to look at alternate possibilities. Or maybe they got angry about something that was really, a 1, and they reacted with a 10. Why did they do that? How could they not do that again? Group activity 2, identifying the different manifestations of anger and the effects of each. Like I talked about earlier, there's passive aggressive, downright aggressive, verbally aggressive, and then taking that aggression and turning it inwards and just being ugly. There's not another really good descriptive word. Grinchy. Grinchy is a good word. The Grinch was a very, very angry little creature. Group activity 3, identify anger triggers. Then for each, try and find a positive reframe or alternate explanation. When we talk about anger, I don't just mean rage. I mean everything from irritation to annoyance to frustration to all-out anger. All of those little ones add up over time. If you get irritated or frustrated constantly, it takes as much of a toll, if not more, than getting really angry once. So identifying what these triggers are and finding positive ways to reframe them. An example that a lot of people can relate to, being in a line at the store and the cashier is just, oh my gosh, slower than molasses on a February day. It can get frustrating because you're like, I got places to be, things to do, yada, yada. You can get angry at her or him. That's not going to do any good. It's not going to speed up the way he or she does his or her job. Noun-pronoun agreement just stinks sometimes. Anyway, I digress. The other thing that you can do is try to get inside that person's world a little bit, in which will also pass the time. They may be doing the very best they can and taxing their mental capacities to the nth degree just doing this job. And if they are, then kudos to them, and I am going to be patient. Maybe they had a bad day. Maybe they've got an infant at home who was up all night sick, throwing up, doing that kind of thing. Been there too. So, all right, they're having a bad day. I'll give them some space. Maybe they got called into their boss's office and got yelled at for some reason, so they're in a bad mood. Again, it's not all about me. Would I like it if they were at work and 100% and woohoo? Yeah, that's not realistic. So let's look at alternate explanations and try to have some compassion for other people instead of just being irritable about how it's negatively impacting me. Going back to that egocentrism. Discuss how either not acting on the anger or not getting angry would have impacted them. So, situation happens. What would have happened if you just wouldn't have gotten angry at all? You would have just been like, whatever, and left. How would that have impacted you? How would it have impacted you if, okay, you got angry for a second and you're like, this is not worth my effort, pulled out your smartphone and started Googling something to read, or started reading the magazines that are always up by the cash register. You know, you could have gotten your eye full of all kinds of trashy gossip or whatever you want to do. Also look at ways you can prevent that in the future. Maybe using self-checkout or not going at the busiest times of day. Finally, identify vulnerabilities or other stressors that predispose people to be more irritable. I know if I go into the grocery store and I'm hungry, my blood sugar's low, and my feet hurt from being on them all day, I am probably not going to be Miss Susie Sunshine, which means everything is probably going to irritate me just a smidge more than it normally would. That's what we call a vulnerability. If you have something happens and you don't sleep well at night, again, if you're like me, you may not be the friendliest, cheeriest person if you don't get your sleep in. Know that's a vulnerability and kind of tell people, I didn't sleep well last night, so give me a wide berth today. After my son was born, when I was working at the residential facility, I would go in and, you know, half the time I'd look sort of disheveled because I was up all night. My staff would be like, a baby's teething, isn't he? I'm like, uh-huh. They'd give me a wide berth. I was just like, you know, I can't deal with drama today, so if it's something really important, I'm all about it. But the he said, she said, this and that, you need to handle it. And they would, because, you know, I said, I know what my vulnerabilities are today, and I know I'm irritable. So it has nothing to do with you. It's me. It's not you, it's me. But it definitely helps in relationships if you can say ahead of time, I know I'm vulnerable to being angry or snippy or not concentrating or whatever it is. Communicating and setting limits discusses finding the right balance between what you need to do and what you feel like you should do when interacting with a person with borderline personality disorder. If you grew up in a borderline family, you feel like you should do whatever it takes to keep the borderline happy. But what do you need to do? What do you need to do for you now that you're a grown-up with needs? Well, you always had needs, but now you know your needs, and a family and other obligations. The borderline wants you to stay a child forever. You need to grow up. You've got to figure out how to navigate that. There are other things, what you should do in order to keep the borderline happy, and what you need to do for your own safety and sanity. It provides practical tools for controlling the flow of communication and interaction with the borderline. The borderline in behaviorism, we talk of extinction bursts. And when somebody stops rewarding a behavior, the person behaving will start doing it more intensely. Like the little kid in the grocery store who wants candy. He asks for it, mom says no. He whines for it, mom says no. He starts screaming for it, mom hopefully says no. But he's trying to escalate his effort in order to get her to give in. Same thing with the borderline parent. They will, well, why aren't you calling me? Why aren't you coming over? If that doesn't work, they may escalate to angry outbursts. They may escalate to really frequent contact, texting, calling, emailing multiple times an hour. This is the extinction burst. Now, I'm not saying it should all be ignored, but I'm saying it is important for people to figure out how to control that amount of communication. If you know that every time you get an email from the borderline parent, it is going to throw you for a loop for a few minutes, then maybe you need to set up a filter in your email so those emails go to a special folder that you can check after work or when you have a designated time. So you're not at work getting ready to go to a meeting, this email comes in and all of a sudden your day explodes. Uses the metaphor of changing the dance from a waltz to a tango to illustrate the concept of changing the relationship. And contains a personal bill of rights. Has people start identifying, what do I have the right to feel, to do, to want, to need, irrespective of the borderline parent. It's hard for a lot of people to figure out what they need or what they want. So I say, okay, here's your child. Your child over here. Use a little Gestalt empty chair thing. What do they have the right to? Do they have the right to their own opinions? Yes. All right. Sometimes it takes a little bit of prodding to get it going, but once you get it going, brainstorm and write on those whiteboards what people have a right to. And there are examples in the book too. Encourages identification of behavioral, verbal, and contextual triggers and vulnerabilities for anger. So we know there are certain situations that we're going to get angry in. Whether it's appropriate or not, it just is. Knowing that that's a situation that may trigger your anger. But there are also contextual triggers where you may be more edgy or more irritable in certain situations than in others. It's important for people to realize what those situations are for them. It includes a section on communicating with the borderline parent and dealing with resistance and rages. Borderline parents, borderline people, do not take it well when you start developing an independent identity. The borderline needs you to be enmeshed because you are part of them. And if you start to separate, that's a problem. Group activity 1, controlling the flow. Identify ways that the borderline and others may violate your boundaries. Calling too much, texting all the time, sending inappropriate or hateful emails, sending emails to your family, friends, and loved ones, spamming all your Facebook people, whatever they do. Discuss ways to deal with this and associated feelings of anger, guilt, resentment, yada, yada. Group activity 2, define what a healthy relationship with a parent would look like. This takes a while. You can start out with Ward and June Cleaver or something that people can relate to in whatever day and age. You have good examples that you can find. Look at the mass media, try to find a family that is relatively healthy. And then talk about realistically what a healthy family looks like. Have each client identify the aspects that are important to them so they can learn to tango. They can learn what steps they need in their dance. Respect, how much communication, how much family interactivity. What is it that they need to have a happy family life? Group activity 3, knowing your rights. Again, the book gives examples of rights for the Bill of Rights. So for each right that the author listed, identify what that looks like for the person. I have the right to feel my own feelings. Okay, but what does that look like? What does that mean? In what ways am I denying myself that right currently? How to communicate these needs and wants and how to handle it if those rights are not respected. If the borderline continues to contradict and criticize, how do you handle that? Activity 4, identify borderline triggers and their functions and ways to prevent triggering them without sacrificing self. So looking at the borderline in your life, what triggers him or her? Most of the time, there are probably a dozen triggers or less, but a dozen's a nice, not round number, that you can identify that when I do this, he or she flies off the handle. If I don't do this, I know there's going to be hell to pay. So identify those and talk about how to prevent that without sacrificing self. Sometimes one of the more common ones is, if I don't go to holiday meals, then I am just the worst person in the whole wide world. But going to holiday meals means being exposed to the borderline person for an indefinite period of time. So how is it that is there a compromise you can find? Maybe going for the hour before the meal, or going for the meal, and maybe you can get scheduled to go to work afterwards. Try to find ways to do it that is self-preserving, but also doesn't trigger the borderline if possible. At a certain point, you've got to decide what's more important, self-preservation or succumbing to the whims of the borderline parent. Activity 5, coping with resistance and rages. Role-playing. It is never easy to deal with it when a parent freaks the freak out. Role play using different validating phrases like those suggested on page 115. I hear you are angry about blah, 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 blah. It's easier to do in real life if you've role played it a bunch of times, so it doesn't sound canned and it doesn't sound patronizing. And you'll find a couple catchphrases that you feel comfortable using. Process after the role play what self-statements, also on page 115, were helpful in retaining composure. Because you're going to have to keep telling yourself, I can do this, it's not about me. This is an especially helpful activity to do and even redo right before the holidays or family gatherings. Reconstructing the past and assessing the present examines the different roles people play in their families and how those roles might be being reconstructed in the present. Remember at the beginning I said we do what we know, and if you learn dysfunction, then you're probably going to repeat dysfunction. Encourages people to write their autobiography from a reporter's lens to gain objective insight to what life was like in your family. From a reporter's lens means you don't have to cover up for anybody. You don't have to make excuses for anybody. It's just the facts, ma'am. Presents the concept that our parents directly and indirectly communicate messages to us about who we are and who we should be, which can be good. But if those messages are inconsistent or consistently negative, it can be bad. It challenges people to find positives in the pain. They survived. What did they learn? Even if they learned all the ways not to be a parent, they did learn something from their parent. And introduces the concept of mindfulness, which is really taking that time to stop and think before people act. Being mindful of what you say and what you do. Stop, do kind of a check-in, go, okay, I'm angry. Is this something to be angry about? Yes, no, how do I proceed? So you've got your own little mental flow chart going on. A lot of behaviors that people learn from the borderline or from the addict revolve around impulsivity. So impulsivity and guilt, big ones. Assessing the present. Stop and think, where are you now? Complete only 1 or 2 sections of this activity per group session, because there's a lot in this activity. For each statement, have clients identify if it applies to them, and if so, give an example. Where are you now in terms of being healthy or in terms of replaying those borderline behaviors from the past? Discuss as a group how to react in a healthier way to life and deal with life on life's terms. Practicing acceptance. Give each client a piece of easel paper. Have them write a statement that validates where they are right now. Have each person go around the room and add a validating statement to everyone else's sheet. So, this is one of those good self-esteem activities. I am good enough because blah, whatever they want to put down. Practicing accepting who they are at this point in time. Flaws and all. The idea in this is to help people see, with everybody going around and contributing to each person's easel paper, helping people see that others see the goodness in them so they can start seeing the goodness in themselves. The future, envisioning change and breaking old habits. Trust yourself, set boundaries, and build self-esteem, and then put it all together. So this is section 3 of the book. We're almost there. Breaking old habits begins by asking clients to envision the future while carefully avoiding simply choosing the opposite because it's the opposite. Everything has a reason. If you like chocolate ice cream, don't choose vanilla just because it's theoretically the opposite of chocolate. Choose it for a reason. And when you stop and you're mindful, maybe you want to choose strawberry instead. Encourage people to start taking care of themselves. If they're getting enough sleep, they're eating well, they're exercising, they're socializing with relatively healthy people, guess what? They're reducing a lot of their vulnerabilities. So it's going to be easier to deal with life on life's terms. Review the thinking errors. Go back to Cognitive Behavioral 101, personalization, magnification, exaggeration, yada yada. And talk about how those are currently being manifested and how the person can counteract those. And discuss how to develop a change plan, prioritizing, maintaining motivation, and including sufficient rewards. Dealing with a borderline parent and changing your own borderline behaviors is exhausting. So how are you going to maintain the momentum? And what are the rewards for that behavior? I'll feel better. Sounds great, but that's generally not enough of a reward. So you need to identify 2 or 3 things that you want to change and figure out how you're going to do it and reward that behavior. Group activity 1, have each group member identify one change they're going to make this week and how they're going to do it. Short-term goals. One change you're going to make this week. Encourage the use of measurable goals and objectives. Identify the motivation and reason for making that change. Why is this important to do right now? And brainstorming and mitigating any obstacles. What could prevent you from making this change? Activity 2, develop a thinking error journal and have group members fill it out for a week, then bring it back to group to process. Give them worksheets that have each of the thinking errors listed so they can write down examples each day of how they did have those thinking errors. And if they were able to contradict them or respond to them appropriately, what did they say? To themselves, obviously. Trust yourself, set boundaries, and build self-esteem. Examines what healthy boundaries look like and how to know if we have them. Discusses how to enforce boundaries, physical and emotional, and begins to explore the concept of self-esteem. Now we're starting to figure out who we are and why we're good enough, smart enough, and people like us. Review the signs of unhealthy boundaries on page 163, and then have clients discuss why they engage in these behaviors. What's the motivation? Why do you do this? How's it working for you? And identify healthier ways to resolve those situations. Finally, putting it all together summarizes what's been learned. Helps people see that, oh, I'm not crazy. And every single patient I've had that's read this book has come back and handed it to me and gone, oh my gosh, for the longest time, I felt like I was completely insane. And it all makes sense now. And I'm like, see? Puts it in perspective, helps them understand that their intuition and their spidey senses, their gut reactions, whatever you want to call it, it was pretty on par most of the time, probably. It encourages clients to remain aware of old behaviors creeping in and new behaviors falling away. So there's old behaviors coming back, the new behaviors, which may not be quite as effective at first or not as fun, creeping back in. And reminds clients that change is a process that takes not only time, but support. You need a battle buddy, or 6. All right, well, don't forget to like our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AllCEUs education so you can be alerted when we publish new videos and new CEUs. You can also use the coupon code 1168SNIPES whenever you make a purchase from newharbinger.com to receive a 25% discount on your order. This book was published by New Harbinger Publications, and like I said, it's one that I'll be doing, one of the many New Harbinger books that I'll be doing reviews on, but it's one of the best that I've ever read. My opinion. Have a wonderful afternoon.